Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere cold. Not only cold the way a case goes cold, though we will spend the next few hours with cases that sat untouched for years, some of them for decades. Cold the way Alaska itself is cold. The kind of cold that swallows a set of footprints before morning, that closes a mountain pass in the time it takes to pour a cup of coffee, that can turn a routine walk to a bus stop or a short flight between two cities into something no one ever comes back from. Tonight we're spending time with 13 of them, 13 cases spread across more than 50 years of Alaska history. Among them, a 20-year-old woman from a village on the Yukon River, home for a weekend and a dental appointment, found in a quiet dormitory bathroom one spring morning, an 18-year-old college freshman who left her house before dawn to walk to class and never arrived, a 19-year-old hospital worker in a small town on the Bering Sea, last seen stepping into a car she had every reason to trust, and 4 men in a small plane, 2 of them among the most senior figures in the country at the time, who lifted off from Anchorage on an ordinary autumn morning and simply vanished into the largest search this country had ever mounted. Before we settle in for this one, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually find value in what we do here. No pressure and no guilt. And thank you truly for all of the case suggestions. Several of tonight's cases came from you. We're also now on Spotify, so the link is in the description if you would rather listen there while you drift off. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable. This is a long one, and these stories deserve to be heard carefully and slowly and with a little more patience than the world gave most of them the first time around, because before they were case numbers, before they were headlines on the mainland, they were people. A daughter saving for braces, a sister who never missed her early class, a young woman who wanted to see Hawaii, a father of 6 who was only trying to get to a campaign rally. Have you ever wondered why so many people vanish in this one state, more than in any other place in the country? Have you ever wondered how a killer can walk free for 25 years in a place where everyone claims to know everyone? And have you ever wondered how many of these stories never get an ending at all? How many families simply grow old inside the not knowing? To understand tonight's cases, we need to understand the place they happened. So let's start there, with the cold itself. Alaska is difficult to hold in your mind at its real size. It is more than twice the size of Texas, and most of it has no roads at all. There are somewhere around 3 million lakes. There are thousands of rivers and thousands of glaciers, many of them riddled with crevasses deep enough to hide a house or a plane or a person and to hide them for good. When people talk about the state having the highest rate of disappearances in the country, more than twice the national average, they sometimes reach for something supernatural to explain it. An energy vortex, a triangle of vanishing, borrowed in name from the one down in the Atlantic, drawn between Anchorage and Juneau and the far northern coast. But you don't need anything supernatural to explain Alaska. The land is enough. A warm front can roll in off the Gulf in minutes and close a pass a pilot has flown 100 times. Snow can bury a scene, an object, or a body within a couple of hours, and then bury it again all winter until spring runs it off into a river. Water that cold pulls the heat out of a body 25 times faster than cold air does. In a place this vast and this empty, looking for a missing person is not like looking for a needle in a haystack. It is closer to looking for one particular blade of grass in the whole field, in the dark while it snows. And here is the quieter, harder truth underneath the scenery. When a case goes cold in a place like this, it can stay cold for a very long time because the resources are thin and the distances are enormous. For years, the Alaska State Troopers kept a list of unresolved homicides that ran past 100 names, and for a long time, that list was little more than a count. No photographs, no summaries, nothing to help the public help solve them. The state's cold case unit has been cut and reshaped more than once. Advocates for missing and murdered Indigenous people have had to push again and again, simply to have their loved ones' names written down and kept. That last part matters tonight more than any theory about vortexes, because Indigenous women in Alaska are murdered by men at rates estimated to be more than 10 times higher than those for white women in the state. Several of the people we're going to spend time with tonight were young Alaska Native women. When you hear how long one of their cases sat and how quickly another might have been prevented, keep that number in the back of your mind, not as a statistic, as a weight. So this is the backdrop. A land big enough to lose almost anything, a system stretched too thin to look for very long, and inside all of it, real people who went about ordinary days that ended in ways no one could have imagined. Some of these cases were finally answered years later by science that did not exist when the crime happened. One was answered almost immediately, and the answer was somehow worse for it. And one has never been answered at all, and probably never will be. Let's start with the one that waited the longest. Let's start with Sophie. Sophie Sergey was 20 years old, and she was almost home free. To understand what that means, you have to know where home was. Sophie was from Pitcairn Point, a small Yupik village on the lower Yukon River in western Alaska, the kind of place that does not appear on most maps of the state and does not need to, because everyone who lives there already knows exactly where it is and exactly who belongs to whom. It sits near the community of St. Mary's, out where the river spreads wide and slow toward the Bering Sea, where in winter the light barely rises and in summer it barely sets. A few hundred people, fish camps in the warm months, snow machines parked in the cold ones, the sort of village where a young woman grows up known and watched over and loved by more than just her own family. Sophie was one of those young women, warm, a little shy, quick to laugh once she trusted you. She had gone away to college at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, which for a kid from a Yukon River village is its own kind of expedition, hundreds of miles from home, a different world of concrete dormitories and fluorescent hallways and strangers from everywhere. She had studied there. And then, in 1992, she made a very practical, very ordinary decision. She left school for a while to earn some money because she wanted to get dental work done, orthodontic work, braces, the kind of thing a 20-year-old saves up for because she is thinking about the rest of her life and what she wants to look like living it. Think about that for a moment because it tells you almost everything about who she was. She was not running from anything. She was planning and saving and thinking ahead. She was a young woman with a future she could see clearly enough to invest in. In the spring of 1993, that plan brought her back to Fairbanks. She flew in a couple of days before with the idea of staying the weekend with friends in the dormitory where she used to live, Bartlett Hall, and then getting her dental appointment taken care of that Monday before flying back home to the village. A short trip, a weekend with people she knew, a bit of medical business, and then home. That was the whole of it. Now picture that Sunday. the last full day anyone would spend with her. It is late April in Fairbanks, which means the deep dark of winter has finally broken, and the light is coming back long and gold in the evenings. And there is that particular lift people in the interior feel when the cold loosens its grip. Sophie spent the day the way you would want to remember a young person spending a day. She went to the movies with friends. She went on a drive. Ordinary, unremarkable, good. The kind of day that leaves no trace in anyone's memory until later, when every hour of it becomes something to hold on to. She came back to Bartlett Hall sometime after midnight. She was staying in the room of a friend, and that night she sat with her friend and her friend's boyfriend, and they had pizza, the three of them, in a dorm room in the middle of the night, talking the way people do when the day is winding down and no one quite wants it to end. And then Sophie said she wanted to step out for a cigarette. You have to sit with how small that is. A cigarette. A few minutes in the hallway or the stairwell or out a side door. The most ordinary interruption there is. Her friend did not think anything of it because there was nothing to think. Sophie stepped out of the room into a building full of sleeping students, a building she knew, on a campus she knew, and she did not come back. She was found the next afternoon. I am going to tell you what happened to Sophie plainly once, and then we are going to move forward, because she deserves to be more than the worst thing that was done to her. On the afternoon of April the 26th, 1993, custodial workers cleaning a second-floor bathroom in Bartlett Hall found her body in a bathtub. She had been sexually assaulted, she had been stabbed, and she had been shot in the back of the head with a small caliber weapon, a .22. She had stepped out for a cigarette in a residence hall full of people, and somewhere in that building, in the space of a few hours, someone had done all of that to her, and no one had heard a thing. Or if they had, no one understood what they were hearing. The word that people who were there keep reaching for all these years later is that the murder shattered something. It shattered the sense of safety at the university. Of course, the ordinary assumption that a dormitory is a place where you are among your own kind and nothing truly terrible can reach you. But it shattered something further away too, back in Pitcairn's Point, back in the villages along the river, where Sophie's mother, Eleanor, and her family now had to absorb the impossible. Their daughter had gone off to the city to build a future, to save for braces, and she was coming home in a way no one is ever ready for. Let's talk about what happened next, because this is where the case begins its long descent into the cold. You would think, in a closed building, on a contained campus, with a body found in a shared bathroom, that this would be a solvable crime. And in a sense, it was. Investigators had something in 1993 that most cases of that era did not reliably have. They had the perpetrator's DNA recovered from the scene of the sexual assault. In theory, that was the answer. In practice, it was a lock with no key, because a DNA profile is only useful if you have something to match it against. And in 1993, the tools to run that match against the wider world simply did not exist. So the Alaska State Troopers did what investigators do. They worked the building, they worked the campus, they interviewed the residents of Bartlett Hall, the friends, the people who had seen Sophie that Sunday, anyone who had been in or near the hall that night. And they turned up the kind of details that, in hindsight, feel like they should have gone somewhere There was, for instance, the matter of a resident who had been working that night as a dormitory security guard and who was later dismissed for having a firearm in the dorm, which was against the rules. That young man denied owning the kind of weapon used to kill Sophie, but he told investigators something that would sit in the case file for a quarter of a century, waiting. He said that his roommate kept a .22 caliber handgun in their room, a specific make, and that roommate lived one floor above the bathroom where Sophie was found. Have you ever wondered how a detail like that can be right there in the file, in plain sight, and still lead nowhere for 25 years? It is because a detail is not proof. A young man owning a common type of small caliber weapon in Alaska, a state where firearms are ordinary household objects, is not evidence of murder. Without a way to tie that specific person to the DNA on Sophie's body, it was a thread with nothing on the end of it. Investigators pulled it, and it held nothing they could use. And so the case went where too many cases in Alaska go. It went quiet. The lead investigator kept working it. He worked it on and off for years until he retired, and he never developed what you could call a concrete suspect, someone he could put in front of a grand jury. Every spring, on the anniversary of the day Sophie was found, a small remembrance was held in Fairbanks. An Episcopal priest named Shirley Lee kept that vigil going year after year so that the community would not do the easy thing, the thing communities always drift toward, which is to forget. Sophie's mother, Eleanor, kept coming back too. There is a photograph from one of those anniversaries, years in, of Eleanor Sergey standing by the Chena River, her hands to her face, having just let a single white carnation go into the water for her daughter. 25 years is a long time to grieve without an answer. It is long enough to lose people who are waiting for one. It is long enough that a young woman who was 20 when she died would have been middle-aged, with a life, with children of her own maybe, with all the braces long since off and forgotten. The case did not just go cold, it aged, and for a very long time, it looked like one more name on that long Alaska list, one more river village family that would grow old inside the not knowing. And then, more than 2 decades after Sophie stepped out for a cigarette, something changed. Not in Alaska, in California, in a suburb, where investigators announced that they'd used a brand new kind of DNA work to identify a man they believed was the Golden State Killer. And a cold case investigator up in Alaska read that news and thought about the DNA that had been sitting in Sophie Sergey's file since 1993, and thought, quietly, let's give this a try. Here is the thing about that new kind of DNA work, and it is worth understanding, because it is going to come up again tonight. For decades, the way police used DNA was simple in concept. You took a genetic profile from a crime scene, and you compared it against a database of profiles taken from people who had been arrested or convicted. If your unknown matched a known offender, you had your man. But if the person who left that DNA had never been arrested, never been swabbed, never entered the system at all, then the profile just sat there, a perfect fingerprint of a total stranger, matching no one. Genetic genealogy changed the question. Instead of asking whether the crime scene DNA matched a known criminal, investigators began asking whether it matched anyone's relatives. Ordinary people, by the hundreds of thousands, had started uploading their own DNA to genealogy websites, trying to find cousins, trying to fill in family trees, trying to learn where they came from, and buried in those family trees was a kind of map. You did not need the killer to have submitted his DNA. You only needed one of his relatives to have done it, an aunt, a cousin, someone who had spit in a tube out of curiosity about their heritage, never imagining what it might one day reveal. So the Alaska investigators sent Sophie's crime scene profile to a company that specialized in this work, and the genealogists went hunting through the branches of strangers' family trees. And the branches narrowed and narrowed again, the way they do, until they pointed at a family, and then at one particular relative, an aunt. And from that aunt, the tree pointed at a man. His name was Stephen Downs. And here is where the case file that had been sitting quiet for 25 years suddenly came alive, because investigators already knew things about Stephen Downs. Not because he was ever a suspect, because of geography. In 1993, Stephen Downs had been an 18-year-old freshman at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. He had lived in Bartlett Hall. He had lived specifically on the floor directly above the bathroom, where Sophie Sergey was found. And you may remember that quarter-century-old detail, the one that had been sitting in the file the whole time, going nowhere. The young security guard who mentioned that his roommate kept a .22 caliber handgun in their room. That roommate was Stephen Downs. The detail had always been there. What had been missing for 25 years was the one thing that could turn a detail into a case. And now they had it. Investigators moved carefully because genetic genealogy does not convict anyone. It only points. It says, look here, look at this family, look at this person. To actually make the case, they still needed to compare Downs' own DNA directly against the DNA left on Sophie. By then, Downs was 44 years old and long gone from Alaska. After graduating from the university in 1996, he had moved to Arizona for a while, and then home to Maine, where he had built an entirely ordinary life. He had become a nurse. He had no criminal record at all, not a single prior arrest. He was, by every outward measure, a settled, middle-aged man in a small New England city, the last person a neighbor would have looked at twice. Investigators obtained a warrant to collect his DNA, and within about 24 hours of taking that sample, the laboratory came back with the answer that Sophie's family had waited a quarter of a century to hear. It matched. The DNA left behind by the man who assaulted and killed Sophie Sergey in 1993 belonged to Stephen Downs. On the 15th of February 2019, Maine State Police arrested him outside a business in Auburn, Maine, without incident. He was charged with first-degree murder and first-degree sexual assault, and he was extradited back to Alaska, back to Fairbanks, back to the town where Sophie had gone to build a future, to stand trial for ending it. That trial mattered for reasons beyond Sophie, though Sophie was always the heart of it. It was the first case in Alaska built on genetic genealogy to actually go before a jury. The state had a number of cold cases that the new science might crack, and prosecutors chose Sophie's case to be the first one tested in open court, in part because the DNA evidence in it was so strong. So there was a weight on that Fairbanks courtroom that went beyond one family's grief. If the science held up here, it could reopen 100 other frozen files. If it fell apart, it might close them. Downs pleaded not guilty. He has never admitted to the crime. His defense argued, among other things, about the DNA, about how it was gathered and how it was used, But the jury heard the evidence, and after deliberating for 2 days, in February of 2022, they found Stephen Downes guilty of the murder and sexual assault of Sophie Sergei. That September, he was sentenced to 75 years in prison. He has continued to maintain his innocence, and he has appealed his conviction, including an appeal that challenges the way genetic genealogy was used to find him in the first place, a legal question that courts around the country are still working through. To be fair to that process, those questions about privacy and DNA are real, and they are not going away, and they deserve to be taken seriously. But the jury that heard all of it reached its verdict, and as of tonight, that verdict stands. 29 years. That is how long it took. From the afternoon custodial workers found Sophie in that bathroom, to the afternoon a jury said the name of the man responsible out loud. Elena Sergei lived to hear it. Not every mother on that long Alaska list does. Now think back to where we started tonight, to the cold that keeps its secrets. For 25 years, this case was frozen, and everyone assumed the same thing people always assume about a frozen case, that it was frozen because there was nothing there, no evidence, no lead, no thread to pull. But that was never true. The evidence had been there the entire time. The killer's DNA had been in the file since the spring of 1993. The detail about the .22 caliber handgun, one floor up, had been in the file for just as long. The name was in the file. Everything needed to solve Sophie's murder existed within days of her death. What did not exist yet was the science to read what they already had. The cold did not hide Sophie's killer in the wilderness. It hid him in plain sight, one floor up, for a quarter of a century, until a stranger's curiosity about her own family tree, thousands of miles away, finally handed investigators the key. So remember Sophie this way, if you remember her at all, not in that bathroom. Remember her that Sunday, at the movies, on a drive, 20 years old with the light coming back over Fairbanks, saving up for braces, a young woman from a village on the Yukon River who was almost home free. She deserved to get her dental work done that Monday. She deserved to fly back to Pitcairn Point and grow old on that river. She deserved every ordinary year that was taken from her. And it took the rest of the world 29 years to admit what happened to her, which tells you something about how easy it is, in a place this big and this cold, to let a young woman's death become a number. Sophie's case was answered by science that arrived decades too late. Our next case was answered the same way, by the same kind of science, and it belongs to a young woman who, like Sophie, simply left one morning to go about an ordinary day. She was 18. She was a college freshman in Anchorage, and she never made it to her 7 o'clock class. Let's talk about Bonnie Craig. Some people are late to everything. Bonnie Craig was early to everything, and that is part of why this story breaks your heart the way it does. Bonnie was 18 years old, a freshman at the University of Alaska Anchorage, and by every account of the people who knew her, she was one of those young women who fills a room without trying to. Warm, funny, well-liked, the kind of daughter and sister and friend who is easy to describe and impossible to replace. She was in a serious, committed relationship with her boyfriend. She was close with her family, close enough that her younger sister, Samantha, who was only 12 at the time, would end up being one of the last people to see her alive. And she was, above all, responsible in the specific, slightly old-fashioned way that some teenagers are. She took her education seriously. She had a 7 o'clock English class, early even by college standards, and she prided herself on never being late for it. Getting to that class was not simple, because the Craigs lived in South Anchorage, and Bonnie did not have a car of her own. 2 mornings a week, she made her own way to campus, and making her own way meant walking. From the family's home to the nearest bus stop was about 2.5 miles. So twice a week, in order to be early for a 7 o'clock class, Bonnie got up in the dark and walked. I want you to be there for a moment, because this is the last ordinary thing she ever did, and it deserves to be seen. It is the 28th of September, 1994. It is around 5 in the morning in Anchorage, and at the end of September, that far north, 5 in the morning is not dawn. It is full dark and it is cold, the first real cold of the season settling in, the mountains behind the city invisible against a black sky. Bonnie steps out of her house, alone, and starts walking. 2.5 miles of empty road and sidewalk, streetlights and long stretches between them, her breath showing in the cold, the whole city still asleep around her. She is not afraid, because there is nothing to be afraid of. She has done this walk before. It is just the thing you do, the price of being a kid without a car who refuses to be late. She has plenty of time. She always leaves plenty of time. She never made it to the bus stop. She never made it to her class. And for most of that day, no one knew anything was wrong, because a college freshman missing a morning class is not by itself an emergency. At about 2:15 that afternoon, more than 9 hours after Bonnie left her house, a woman was out walking near McHugh Creek. If you have driven south out of Anchorage along the Seward Highway, hugging the edge of Turnagain Arm with the water on one side and the rock face rising on the other, you have passed McHugh Creek, whether you noticed it or not. It is a scenic spot, a pull-off, a place with trails and a creek tumbling down toward the inlet. It is also a good 15 miles from where Bonnie had been walking to catch her bus. The woman looked down and saw a body in the water. She called the troopers. Bonnie Craig was face down, submerged in McHugh Creek. She had drowned, but she had also suffered terrible injuries to the back of her head, nearly a dozen deep lacerations to her skull. And near the creek, there was a cliff, roughly 30 feet high, the kind of drop that could kill a person who fell from it. So the first story the scene seemed to tell was the simplest one. A young woman, up on the rocks near the creek, had somehow fallen from the cliff, struck her head, and drowned in the water below. A hiking accident, a tragedy, but an ordinary tragedy, the kind Alaska produces every single year, because the land is beautiful and the land is lethal, and the line between the two is thinner than tourists ever believe. The Alaska State Troopers, at first, leaned toward exactly that, an accident, a terrible, senseless accident. There was only one problem with the accident. Her mother did not believe it for a second. Karen, Bonnie's mother, did the hardest thing a parent can do. She went to see her daughter's body, and she looked, really looked, in the way that only a mother who refuses to be told a comforting story will look. And what she saw did not match the story of a girl who slipped and fell. She saw wounds on Bonnie's hands, defensive wounds, the marks a person gets when they are trying to fend something off, when they are throwing their arms up against a blow, when they are fighting. You do not get defensive wounds falling off a cliff. You get them from another person. Have you ever wondered how many cases would have quietly closed as accidents as misadventures, as no one's fault if a mother somewhere had not stood in a cold room and refused to accept the easy version, because that is what happened here. Karen would not let it go, and slowly the accident theory began to come apart, replaced by something far worse and far truer. Consider the geography alone. Bonnie had left home to walk 2.5 miles to a bus stop in South Anchorage. Her body was found roughly 15 miles further south, down the highway, at a creek she had no reason to visit, at a time of day when she should have been in class, and then at the library, and then heading home. She did not drive. She had no way to get to McHugh Creek on her own. Someone had taken her there. And then there was the physical evidence, which investigators and the medical examiner kept turning over. The injuries to the back of Bonnie's head were not really consistent with a simple fall. They looked like the result of blows, of a blunt object or a weapon, struck deliberately and more than once. There was a detail that would come up later, almost unbearable in its precision. A single leaf found up above the cliff area with Bonnie's blood on it. If her blood was already on a leaf at the top of the cliff, then she was already bleeding, already injured before she ever went over the edge. The fall had not caused her injuries. Her injuries had come first, and the fall, if there even was one, came after. Piece by piece, the picture assembled itself into something that no mother should ever have to be right about. Bonnie had not slipped. Bonnie had been taken, somewhere on the dark early morning walk to the bus stop, by someone with a car. She had been driven 15 miles south. She had been assaulted and beaten, and she had ended up in the freezing water of McHugh Creek. And whoever had done it had driven away and left her there, and had very nearly gotten away with calling it an accident. But like Sophie Sergi's case, Bonnie's case had one thing going for it, one thing the killer could not clean up or drive away from. During the investigation, biological evidence was recovered from Bonnie's body, evidence that carried the DNA of the man who had attacked her. In 1994, that profile went into the system and waited, the same way Sophie's did, a perfect record of a stranger, matching no one on file. And Anchorage, unlike some places, did not let itself forget. As the months and then the years went by with no arrest, the city filled up with a question. It went up on posters, it went up on the sides of buses. 3 words that everyone who lived in Anchorage in those years still remembers. Who killed Bonnie? The answer to that question, the one on all those posters, was already sitting in a prison cell. It just happened to be a prison cell on the other side of the continent, and it would take 12 years and a stroke of grim luck for anyone to connect the two. For those 12 years, Bonnie's case did what Sophie's case did. It went cold. Leads came and went and led nowhere. Karen and the rest of the family lived inside the same suspended grief that Eleanor Sergi knew, the particular exhaustion of loving someone whose killer has a face and a name that no one can yet see. They kept the question alive. The city kept it alive. But keeping a question alive is not the same as answering it. And year after year, the answer stayed just out of reach. Then, in 2006, it arrived. And it arrived because of the way the justice system quietly files people away. Across the country, in New Hampshire, a man named Kenneth Dion had been convicted in a string of armed robberies. And when you are convicted of felonies like that, your DNA gets taken and entered into the national database, the same database that had held Bonnie's unknown killer's profile, matching no one since 1994. This time, when Dion's profile went in, it did not match no one. It matched the DNA recovered from Bonnie Craig. And when investigators pulled the file on Kenneth Dion and looked at where he had been in the autumn of 1994, everything lined up in a way that was both an answer and an indictment of the system that produced him. Because Kenneth Dion had been in the Anchorage area at the time of Bonnie's murder. He had a history of violence, including prior assault charges, and he was. At the moment, Bonnie was walking to a bus stop in the dark, a man who should not have been walking free at all. He had been released from an Alaska prison only a few months earlier. He was on probation, and investigators came to believe that Bonnie's killing was very likely a random act, not someone who knew her, not a boyfriend, not a stranger she had arranged to meet, none of the things police first look for, just a man with a car, driving in the pre-dawn dark, who saw a teenage girl walking alone along an empty road and decided to stop. There is a detail here that the prosecutor would later put into words at the sentencing, and it is one of the hardest things in this entire case to sit with. Dion had violated the terms of his probation on those earlier Alaska robberies roughly 2 years before Bonnie died. He should have been arrested for that violation. He was not. And the prosecutor, looking back across all of it, said plainly what everyone in that courtroom already understood. There was no question this was a man who needed to be taken off the streets. And if he had been, Bonnie would still be here. Sit with that. Bonnie Craig did not die because Alaska is big and cold and dangerous, though it is all of those things. She did not wander off a trail. She did not misjudge the wilderness. She died because a violent man who had already been caught, already been convicted, already been put in a cell, was let back out and then not brought back in when he broke the rules of his release. And in the window that mistake left open, he crossed paths with an 18-year-old girl who was only trying to get to her English class on time. The cold did not kill Bonnie. The cold just hid the evidence long enough for the science to catch up. What put her killer on that road was a much more ordinary kind of failure, the kind that happens in warm offices, in daylight, on paper. In May of 2007, Kenneth Dion was charged with the rape and murder of Bonnie Craig. Extraditing him and bringing the case to trial took years, and it was not until 2011, nearly 17 years after Bonnie's body was found in McHugh Creek, that Kenneth Dion finally stood trial in Anchorage. That trial ran for 21 days, and Dion did not go quietly. His defense did not dispute that his DNA was on Bonnie's body. They could not. Instead, they told the jury a different story about how it got there. They claimed that Dion and Bonnie had known each other, that they had consensual sexual contact, possibly as much as a week before she died, and that on the day she died, Bonnie had simply gone to McHugh Creek on her own and fallen from the cliff by accident. Kenneth Dion, they said, was not even there that day. It was a story with a great many holes, and the prosecution walked the jury through every one of them. When Kenneth Dion was first questioned, he told police he did not know Bonnie Craig at all. That was his first account. Only later, once the DNA made denial impossible, did the story change into one where he had known her well enough to have been intimate with her. But Bonnie's family did not know him. Her friends did not know him. Her boyfriend did not know him. There was no one in Bonnie's life who could place this man anywhere near it, which is a strange kind of absence for someone the defense now claimed had been her lover. Then, there was the day itself, Dion could not account for where he had been. His own wife told investigators that he had not been home the entire week. The medical examiner was clear that the wounds to the back of Bonnie's head had been made by a blunt object or a weapon, not by the rocks at the bottom of a cliff, and it was noted that Dion kept martial arts weapons in his car, and there was that single leaf up above the cliff, carrying Bonnie's blood, quietly contradicting the entire theory of an accidental fall because it proved she was bleeding before she went down. The prosecutor, a man named Paul Miovis, put together for the jury what he believed had actually happened, and it accounted for the evidence in a way the defense never could. Dion had pushed Bonnie from the cliff. She had struck a rocky ledge on the way down, which was where much of that blood came from. And then, with Bonnie lying wounded in the creek below, Dion had climbed down after her and delivered the final, fatal blows. It explained the lack of blood in the places you would expect it and the presence of it in the places you would not. It was methodical, it was deliberate, and it was the opposite of an accident. There was one more thing, quieter than the forensics, but just as damning to the defense's story. Bonnie was in a committed, serious relationship. The people who loved her were united on this point, that she simply would not have had a secret sexual relationship with a stranger, and her boyfriend was permitted to tell the jury as much. The defense's entire theory rested on a version of Bonnie that the people who actually knew her did not recognize. The jury did not take long. After a trial that had stretched across 21 days, they returned in a matter of hours on the 15th of June 2011 and found Kenneth Dion guilty of the rape and murder of Bonnie Craig. Nearly 17 years after a woman out for a walk looked down into McHugh Creek, Anchorage finally had the answer to the question on all those posters. The sentencing came that autumn on the 31st of October. There is something almost unbearably tender about the small details of that day. Bonnie's family came to court wearing scarves and ties printed with her picture, so that she would be present, so that she would be seen. They left Halloween cookies on the prosecution's table. And then Kenneth Dion was led in, his hands shackled, the word lost tattooed across one set of knuckles, and the word soul across the other, and the room went quiet. Judge Jack Smith did not hold back. He described the killing as a calculated, methodical beating, and he found that it fit the legal definition of a worst offense when measured against other murders. He sentenced Dion to the maximum on both counts, 99 years for the first-degree murder and 25 years for the sexual assault, 124 years in total, with no time suspended. When the judge offered Dion the chance to speak, to say anything at all, Dion declined. "I have nothing to say," he told the court, "at all." He has never admitted what he did. He appealed his conviction, arguing, among other things, that the warrant used to obtain his DNA was flawed. And in 2015, an appeals court rejected that argument and upheld the verdict. To this day, he denies it. The conviction stands. But Karen, Bonnie's mother, the woman who had refused from the very first day to accept the comforting story of an accident, did have something to say, and she said it to Dawn's face. She called him a heartless, soulless coward, and she told him she hated him. And then she said something that I think about often, because it is the sound of a person choosing deliberately not to be swallowed by the darkness that took her child. She thanked him. She thanked him for being careless enough to get caught, and she thanked him, of all things, for showing her evil so that she would know to cherish what is good. That is where Bonnie's case rests tonight, answered at last by the same patient science that answered Sophie's, the DNA sitting in a database for over a decade until the right cell door somewhere else in the country swung open and dropped the name into the machine. But remember the other half of it, the part that has nothing to do with the cold or the wilderness. Bonnie Craig crossed paths with her killer because that killer had already been caught once and let go, and then broke the rules of his release and was not brought back in. The science answered who, the failure answered how he was ever there to begin with. Our first two cases went cold for years and were solved by a laboratory. The next one was solved in a matter of weeks, which should have been a mercy. Instead, it revealed something that a small town on the edge of the Bering Sea has never fully recovered from, because the answer to who killed 19-year-old Sonia Ivanov was not a stranger passing through. It was someone the whole town had been raised to trust. Let's talk about Sonia. Nome sits out at the end of things. It is a small town on the edge of the Bering Sea, in western Alaska, a few thousand people on a spit of land where the road system quite literally runs out. You cannot drive to Nome. You fly, or you come by sea. In the winter, the sea ice presses in, and the wind comes off it with nothing to slow it down, and the town turns inward on itself. Everyone known to everyone, the way small places on the edge of the world always are. It is the kind of town where you would think a young woman could walk home at night in the rain and be perfectly safe, because who is there, really, to be afraid of? Everyone knows everyone. That was the whole comfort of the place. And that comfort is exactly what this story takes apart. Sonia Ivanov was 19 years old, an Alaska native woman from the village of Unalakleet, another of those small communities scattered along the western coast where life runs on subsistence and family and the rhythm of the seasons. She was one of 6 children. She had graduated from high school in 2002 and moved to Nome to start building a life. And by the summer of 2003, she had put together exactly the kind of modest, hopeful beginning that a 19-year-old is supposed to have. She had a job working the admitting desk at Norton Sound Regional Hospital. She was saving her money because she had a plan, and her plan was to go to college somewhere far away and warm. She wanted to go to school in Hawaii. Picture that for a second. A young woman from the Bering Sea coast, where the sun barely climbs in winter, saving hospital paychecks with her eyes fixed on Hawaii. The people who knew her used the same handful of words: goofy and fun and kind. She was a genuinely good basketball player, well enough known on the court that people in the surrounding communities recognized her name. Her best friend and roommate, a young woman named Timaya Tawarak, had followed her to Nome, and the two of them lived together and, having no car, walked everywhere they needed to go. They felt safe doing it. Nome felt like home. Now picture the night of the 10th of August 2003. It is late summer, which in Nome means the light lingers and the weather is soft and rainy rather than brutal. Sonia and Timur had spent the evening at a friend's house, a group of them hanging out, playing board games, the most wholesome night you can imagine. Around 1 in the morning, the two friends left together. Timur had to work early the next day, so she decided to crash at a friend's place nearby. Sonia had the next day off, so she wanted to stay out a little longer. And so, at the corner where their paths split, they said goodnight. Timur walked toward her friend's house. Sonia kept going, on foot, in the direction of the home they shared. That is the last time Timur saw her best friend alive. But Sonia was seen again that night by 2 other people. And what they saw is the center of this entire case. A short time later, at around 26 minutes past 1 in the morning, two sisters were out and noticed a young woman walking. One of them recognized her. "That is Sonia Ivanov," she said, because she had recently watched Sonia play in a City League basketball game and knew who she was. The sisters watched Sonia walk down the street. And then, less than a block away, a marked police vehicle, a Nome Police Department cruiser, pulled in front of her on the street. The passenger window came down. Sonia leaned into the window, the way you do when someone you know or someone in a uniform stops to talk to you. And after a moment, she opened the door, climbed in, and the cruiser drove away. It drove away in a direction that was not towards Sonia's home. The sisters did not see who was inside the vehicle. They had no reason to think anything was wrong. It was a police car. In a town like Nome, a police car stopping to offer a young woman a ride home in the rain at 1 in the morning is not a threat. It is a courtesy. It is the town taking care of its own. That is what makes it so hard to hold. The last safe-looking thing that happened to Sonia Ivanov, the thing that should have meant she was protected, was the thing that killed her. The next day, Sonia did not come home and did not turn up at any of the places her friends checked. By the afternoon of the 12th of August, more than a day and a half after she was last seen, Timur reported her missing to the Nome police, and the town did what small Alaska towns do when one of their own goes missing. They searched. People went out on foot, in their cars, even in small aircraft, combing the roads and the tundra around town, everyone telling themselves the hopeful version that Sonia had just stayed over somewhere, that she had gotten a ride out to a fish camp, that she would turn up embarrassed at all the fuss. On the evening of the 12th of August, a volunteer firefighter was following a set of fresh tire tracks down a rarely used road toward a gravel pit outside of town. The tracks led him to Sonia. She was lying near a pool of her own blood, undressed, with a single sock still on one foot. She had been shot once in the back of the head with a small caliber weapon, a .22, fired at point-blank range. There was no evidence that she had been sexually assaulted. What there was, instead, was a kind of care that troubled investigators from the very beginning, because it was the wrong kind of care. There were almost no traces at the scene, no shell casing left behind where you would expect one, no stray evidence of the attacker. A vehicle had driven through the pool of blood and left tire tracks, and one of the treads did not match the others, suggesting a vehicle running mismatched tires. But of the killer himself, there was almost nothing. Whoever had done this had known, it seemed, exactly what not to leave behind. And that, in the end, was the first thread. Because in a town of a few thousand people who moves through a crime scene like they have been trained to think about evidence, who knows not to leave a shell casing, not to leave a print, not to leave a trace, the town spent those first days afraid that a stranger, a drifter, someone passing through had killed Sonia and might still be out there. But as the evidence came in, the fear slowly turned a corner and began to point in a direction almost no one in Nome could bear to look. It did not point out toward the tundra, toward some outsider. It pointed back into town. It pointed at the police. The Alaska State Troopers were brought in, at the request of the Nome Department itself, to take over the investigation. And as they worked, they kept coming back to the sighting by the two sisters. A young woman getting into a marked police cruiser at 1:30 in the morning, and then turning up dead. There were only 2 officers on duty in Nome that night. One of them came forward, promptly and without fuss, took a polygraph and passed it. The other did not fit so cleanly. His name was Matthew Owens. Owens was 28 years old. He had been with the Nome Police Department for years, a sworn officer, a familiar face in a town where every face is familiar. And as troopers looked at him, the ground began to shift. He could not account for his whereabouts during the window when Sonia was killed. He failed a polygraph. His own ex-wife would later tell investigators something that lands like a stone dropped into still water. Owens had called her, she said, and told her that he needed her to take their son because a girl had gone missing and he had to head in to work. But he told her that before Sonia Ivanov had been reported missing to anyone, before the search, before the town knew, he knew a girl was gone before a girl was known to be gone. Then there was the matter of the stolen cruiser. As the investigation tightened around the department and officers were preparing to fly out for interviews, one of the department's own patrol vehicles suddenly went missing. And then Owens radioed in a frightening story. He said he was being attacked out at a sand and gravel pit by men who had ambushed him. Officers raced to the scene. What they found was the missing patrol vehicle, its windows broken out, and Matthew Owens standing beside it, unharmed. There were no attackers. There was no sign of any struggle that could have produced what he described. But inside the vehicle, there was an envelope. And inside the envelope was Sonia Ivanov's missing identification card, along with a note. The note was a taunt, addressed to the police, full of hatred for cops, warning them to back off the Ivanov investigation. It was meant to look like the real killer was still out there, still watching, still dangerous, and that he wanted the police to stop looking. But it did not hold together. When investigators tried to reconstruct the attack Owens described, they found it was essentially impossible to have happened the way he said. One of them, in a recorded interview, put it to Owens flatly. If that had really happened, they told him, you would be dead. We would be investigating your murder right now. And the note itself, the taunt from the supposed real killer, was traced to a printer that Owens had access to. The whole scene, troopers came to believe, had been staged by Owens to point the investigation away from himself. It did the opposite. It pointed straight at him. The physical evidence closed the distance. Traces of Sonia's clothing were found burned in a fire pit some 75 miles from Nome. And in that same pit, investigators found a key that belonged to Owens' own uncle. A friend of Owens told investigators he had seen Sonia's identification card in Owens' home, the same card that later turned up in that staged cruiser, and the near-total absence of evidence at the original scene, the thing that had unsettled investigators from the start, now made a terrible kind of sense. The killer had known exactly what not to leave behind, because the killer had been trained to look for exactly those things. Matthew Owens was fired from the Nome Police Department, and on the 25th of October, 2003, he was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and tampering with evidence. And then something happened that always seems to happen once a man like this is finally exposed, and it is the part of Sonia's story that reaches furthest beyond Sonia herself. Other women began to come forward, native Alaskan women who said that Owens had picked them up in his vehicle while he was on duty in uniform and had assaulted them. And they had said nothing because Owens had made sure they understood the arithmetic of their situation. He had told them, in one form or another, that no one would ever believe a drunk native woman over a police officer. He had counted on that silence. For a while, he'd been right to. Think about what that means. Sonia was very likely not the first woman Owens harmed. She was the one he killed. And the reason the earlier women stayed quiet was not weakness. It was a clear-eyed reading of exactly how much their word was worth against a badge in a system that had already shown them, again and again, that it was not built to protect them. That is the same quiet arithmetic that lets indigenous women in Alaska be murdered at rates many times higher than other women. And it is the same arithmetic that leaves so many of those cases unsolved. Owens did not just exploit Sonia. He exploited the entire structure of who gets believed. Justice, when it finally came, did not come easily. The first trial was held in Nome itself in the beginning of 2005, and it ended in a hung jury. And you can understand why, in a town that small. Jurors had attended the same church as Matthew Owens. Everyone knew everyone, which had been the town's comfort and was now its trap. Sonia's own brother, Jacob, said afterward that he had known from the beginning that Nome was the wrong place to try the man, that the ties ran too deep. So the second trial was moved out to Kotzebue, another hub community up on the coast, far enough to find a jury that had not sat in the pews beside the accused. And on the 6th of December, 2005, that jury found Matthew Owens guilty of first-degree murder and tampering with evidence. He was sentenced to 101 years in prison. Sonia's death changed the law. In 2007, the Alaska legislature passed what became known as the Sonia Ivanov Law, which requires that a police officer convicted of committing murder while on duty be sentenced to at least 99 years. Her name is on the books of the state now, attached to the principle that when the people we trust to protect us instead become the danger, the punishment must be absolute. Owens has appealed and sought relief more than once over the years, and each time the conviction has stood. He is still in prison. But no law brings Sonia back to the hospital admitting desk, or to the basketball court, or onto that plane to Hawaii she was saving for. The cold did not take Sonia Ivanov. A man in a uniform did, in a town where a police car was supposed to be the safest thing on the road. And when you think about how many other women he hurt first, women who knew better than to speak, you start to understand that some of the coldest things in Alaska have nothing to do with the weather. Our first 3 cases were all answered in the end, whether by a laboratory or by a badge that could not cover its own tracks. The next man we are going to talk about was answered too, eventually. But for years he moved through Anchorage as one of its most ordinary, respectable citizens, a family man, a business owner, while he used the vast Alaska wilderness itself as his hunting ground and his hiding place, and while the women he chose were, once again, the women the world had already decided not to look for. Let's talk about Robert Hansen, and more importantly, about the women he was never supposed to be caught for. Before we say a single word about the man, we're going to talk about the women, because for more than a decade, almost no one else did. That silence is not a detail of this case. It is the case. Through the 1970s and into the early 1980s, women were disappearing from Anchorage, not many at once. One here, months later, another. The kind of spacing that does not set off alarms. And they were, almost all of them, women that a certain kind of city has trained itself not to see. They worked the bars and the clubs along 4th Avenue, in the part of Anchorage that everyone knew about and no one talked about. They were sex workers. They were exotic dancers. Some were young women who had come north the way so many people come north, chasing money or escape or a fresh start in a boom town flush with pipeline cash, and who had no family nearby to notice when they stopped calling. That is the terrible engineering of it. When one of these women vanished, the machinery that is supposed to grind into motion, the searches, the flyers, the frantic parents on the local news, simply did not start. A dancer misses her shift. A woman is not at her usual corner, and the assumption every time is that she moved on, went back to the lower 48, took up with someone, drifted, the way transient people are imagined to drift. In a city full of people passing through, a person passing out of view does not look like a crime. It looks like Tuesday. So let me give some of them their names, because names are the least they are owed. There was a young woman found in a shallow grave off a lake road, so early in all of this, and so far from anyone who knew her, that she was never identified at all. Investigators, needing to call her something, called her Eklutna Annie, after the place she was found. She has a nickname instead of a name, and she has had it for over 40 years. There was Sherry Morrow, who was 23. There was Joanna Messina. There was Paula Goulding, who was 30, an exotic dancer, found on the bank of the Knik River. There were others, some never found, some never named. One of them known to this day only as Horseshoe Harriet. Now picture the country where they were found, because the country is part of what happened to them. The Knik River runs out of the Matanuska-Susitna Valley, north and east of Anchorage, into a spread of braided channels and gravel bars and brush that goes on and on, wilderness you cannot walk out of and cannot easily search. This is not a back alley. This is the Alaska bush, reachable in places only by boat or by small plane. When the bodies of Sherry Morrow and Paula Goulding were finally discovered, months after they vanished, they were in shallow graves out along that river, far from the city where they had lived their lives. They had been shot, and there was a detail that told investigators they were dealing with something methodical and something patient. The women had been shot, it appeared, while undressed, and then dressed again, before they were buried. Near the graves, investigators found spent shell casings from a high-powered hunting rifle, and the ballistics kept telling the same story. One gun had fired on more than one of these women. Have you ever wondered what it takes for a pattern like that to finally be seen? Because the pieces were there for years. Bodies kept turning up in shallow graves, all of them out along the same stretch of wilderness, all of them tied to the same caliber of round. But Anchorage was a transient city, and the victims were women the city had already decided not to count. And so the dots sat there, unconnected, for a long, long time. It took a detective with the Alaska State Troopers, a man named Glenn Floth, and a small team willing to treat these women as victims of a single hunter, rather than as a series of unrelated women who had simply moved on, to begin drawing the lines between them. And this is the part that is hardest to say plainly, so I will say it once and move on. The man doing this was not chasing these women through the wilderness by accident of geography. He was doing it on purpose. He would take a woman out into that country by plane or by truck, and in some cases he would let her go, set her loose in the vastness, and then hunt her with a rifle across the same ground He hunted animals. The remoteness was not a place he happened to leave the bodies. The remoteness was the weapon. It gave him a hunting ground the size of a small country, and it gave him the near certainty that whatever he did out there, the snow and the brush and the braided river would keep his secret. For years it did. So who was he? And the answer is the most unsettling part of the whole thing, because the answer is almost nobody. Robert Hansen was a baker. That is not a detail invented for irony. He ran a bakery in Anchorage. He was good at it. And to the people who bought bread from him, he was a quiet, mild, unremarkable man in horn-rimmed glasses with a noticeable stutter. He was a husband. He was a father of two. He was, by day, so thoroughly ordinary that when a young woman first accused him of a violent assault, back in the early 1970s, his meekness and his humble trade and an alibi from a friend were enough to make the police set him aside. He had run-ins with the law over the years. There had been accusations, but a stammering neighborhood baker with a wife and kids does not fit anyone's idea of a hunter. And so he was, again and again, allowed to remain exactly what he appeared to be. He was also a skilled pilot and an experienced hunter, and he kept a small plane at Merrill Field in Anchorage. Those two ordinary Alaska hobbies, flying and hunting, were the other half of him, the half that let him carry women out into country no search party would ever reach. The thing that finally undid him was not a body. It was a survivor. It was a 17-year-old girl who did the one thing all the arithmetic said would never matter. She got away, and she was believed. On the 13th of June, 1983, Hansen approached a 17-year-old named Cindy Paulson in downtown Anchorage. What happened next followed the pattern investigators would later come to know too well. He offered her money, and once she was in the car, he drew a gun. He took her to his house, to the basement, and he held her there and assaulted her. And then he brought her to Merrill Field, to his plane, telling her he was going to fly her out to a cabin. It was the last stop on a route that, for other women, had ended in the wilderness. But Cindy Paulson did not wait to find out. While Hansen was busy loading the cockpit of his plane, his back turned, she ran, barefoot, still handcuffed. She got out of that car and ran across the airfield toward the road, and she flagged down a passing truck, and the driver, a man named Robert Yunt, got her away from there and got her to help. Within hours, she was at the police, still in the handcuffs, describing everything she could remember: the layout of the house and the basement, the plane and the airfield, and the stutter in the man's voice. Sit with the difference between Cindy Paulson and the women who came before her. Hansen had released other women over the years and let them go precisely because he was betting they would never be believed, and for a long time that bet paid out. Cindy Paulson broke it. She ran, and she remembered every detail, and when she told her story this time, someone finally listened. The detective, Glenn Floth, and his team took her account and laid it against the growing file of murdered women, and the shapes matched. An FBI profiler even built a portrait of the kind of man they were looking for: someone with low self-esteem, someone who would likely have a speech impediment, and the portrait fit Hansen like a coat. He denied all of it, of course, and once again he produced an alibi from a friend. But this time, the investigators did not stop at the alibi. They went back to the friend, and they pushed, and the alibi came apart in their hands. With that, they had enough to search Hansen's home. and what they found there ended any doubt. Hidden in the house was a stash of jewelry, keepsakes taken from women who were dead or missing. There were firearms, including a hunting rifle that matched the shell casings found beside the bodies out along the nick, and tucked into the headboard of his own bed, where he slept every night beside his wife, was an aviation map of the Alaska bush, marked with rows of small, handwritten marks, more than 20 of them. Each mark was a place. Many of them matched the spots where bodies had already been found. Others pointed to places no one had thought to look yet. Confronted with the map and the trophies and the rifle, Robert Hansen confessed. He pleaded guilty to a handful of the murders and, in his confession, admitted to killing 17 women and to assaulting many more over the years. In early 1984, he was sentenced to 461 years in prison, plus life, with no possibility of parole, and he was sent to a correctional center down in Seward, on the coast. He died there in custody of natural causes in 2014, an old man of 75. He never had to answer for most of what he did in any way that mattered to the women he took. And here is the part that keeps this case from ever fully closing, the part that belongs to the wilderness and the cold. As part of his plea, Hansen agreed to help investigators find the graves he had marked on that map. He led them to some of them, but of the 17 women he admitted killing, only 12 were ever recovered. The rest are still out there, somewhere in that enormous country, in ground he marked with a pencil and then could not or would not fully lead anyone back to. And some of the women who were found have never even been identified. That young woman from the very beginning, the one they called Eklutna Annie because they had nothing else to call her, has been waiting for her name for more than 40 years. Another is known only as Horseshoe Harriet. They were somebody's daughters. They had real names given to them by people who loved them. And because of who the world had already decided they were, those names have been lost, maybe for good. So remember this case for the women, the way almost no one did while it was happening. Remember that Robert Hansen did not get away with it for over a decade because he was clever. He got away with it because he chose women that a whole city had agreed in advance not to look for, and because the Alaska wilderness was more than willing to keep what he fed it. The cold hid the bodies, but it was indifference that hid the crime. And in the end, it took a barefoot, handcuffed 17-year-old running across an airfield to prove that one of these women's words could be worth more than a quiet man's alibi. Everything we have talked about tonight has been a story of the system failing to catch the guilty. Sophie's killer walked free for a quarter of a century. Bonnie's killer had been caught once and let go. Sonia's killer wore the badge. Robert Hansen was set aside by police again and again because he did not look the part. Failing to catch the guilty is one kind of injustice, and it has run through every case so far. But there is another kind, and it is the mirror image, and it is somehow even harder to look at. It is what happens when the system, under pressure to solve something terrible, stops looking for the guilty at all, because it has decided it already has someone who will do. And in a city in the interior of Alaska, on a cold night in the autumn of 1997, that is exactly what happened. And it cost a murdered boy his justice and 4 young men 18 years of their lives. Let's talk about John Hartman and about the 4 men who did not kill him. Start with the boy, because he's too often left out of his own story. John Hartman was 15 years old. He was a kid in Fairbanks, and on a night in early October of 1997, he was beaten savagely on a downtown street and left there, alone, in the cold. He did not survive. Whatever else this case became, however tangled it got, that fact sits at the bottom of all of it. A 15-year-old boy was murdered, and his family had to bury a child, and they deserved, more than anyone, for the right person to answer for it. They never got that. And the reason they never got it is the same reason 4 other families spent the next 18 years visiting their sons in prison. Fairbanks in 1997 was a city under pressure. A young white teenager had been beaten to death on a public street, and the community wanted an answer, quickly, the way communities always do when a child is killed. And in that climate, the investigation turned toward the city's native population and did not turn back. Within a short time, 4 young men were arrested for John Hartman's murder. Their names were Marvin Roberts, Eugene Vent, George Fries, and Kevin Pease. 3 of them were Alaska Native. 1 was American Indian. And that detail, the fact that all 4 were indigenous in a case with a white victim, is not a footnote. Many people, including Alaska Native leaders who fought for these men for 2 decades, have argued it was the whole engine of what went wrong. Because here is what the case against them actually consisted of, when you take it apart. There was no physical evidence tying any of the 4 to the killing. None. In a beating that brutal, you would expect blood. You would expect the victim's blood on the attackers, something, anything, transferred between bodies in a violent struggle on the ground. There was nothing of the kind linking these 4 young men to John Hartman. What the case rested on instead was a pair of confessions given by intoxicated young men under interrogation. Confessions that did not even match the facts of the crime cleanly, and the testimony of witnesses who were themselves troubled, unreliable, and in at least one crucial case would later take it all back. You have to understand what a confession is worth and what it is not. A confession feels like the end of a question. It feels like certainty. But confessions from frightened, intoxicated young people pulled into an interrogation room in the middle of the night with the full weight of a grieving city pressing down on the police are among the least reliable things in all of criminal justice. We know this now, from case after case across the country, from people who confessed in detail to crimes that DNA later proved they could not have committed. In 1997, in Fairbanks, that understanding had not yet arrived. And so a jury heard confessions and heard witnesses and did what juries do. They believed it. All 4 young men were convicted of the murder of John Hartman, and all 4 were sent away for decades. And that, for a very long time, was the official end of the story. The case was closed. The city had its answer. 4 native men were in prison, and a boy was in the ground, and everyone was supposed to move on. The 4 men never moved on because they had a peculiar and terrible advantage. They knew, with total certainty, something the rest of the world was not sure of. They knew they had not done it. For 18 years, that certainty was almost the only thing they had. Marvin Roberts, Eugene Vent, George Fries, and Kevin Pease held onto their innocence through appeal after appeal, through the slow, grinding years that a prison sentence is actually made of. Birthdays and funerals missed, children growing up in visiting rooms, and outside the walls, something began to build around them. Alaska Native leaders, who had watched this case from the start and recognized the pattern in it, refused to let it be forgotten. Advocates organized. The case picked up a name, the Fairbanks Four, and it became less a set of four separate appeals and more a movement, a standing question put to the whole state about who its justice system was built to protect and who it was built to process. The turning point came through the Alaska Innocence Project and through a lawyer named Bill Oberle, who filed for post-conviction relief in 2013. And then came the thing that changes cases like this, when they change at all. Another man came forward. A man already serving time elsewhere gave a sworn account that it was he and a group of his own friends who had beaten John Hartman that night, and that the four men in prison had nothing to do with it. He pointed the finger at a different group entirely, one that had never been charged. Now, to be fair, and this case demands that we be careful, that confession did not by itself prove anything in a courtroom, and the people it implicated have their own presumption of innocence, which still stands, because no one from that other group has ever been convicted of John Hartman's murder either. But it was enough, combined with everything else, to force the courts to look again. In 2015, a Fairbanks judge allowed a full evidentiary hearing, 6 weeks of it, in which the entire case was pulled apart in the open. A key witness recanted. The absence of physical evidence, which had been quietly stepped over back in the 90s, was now impossible to ignore. And the picture that emerged was of a conviction that could not stand. On the 17th of December 2015, after 18 years, Marvin Roberts, Eugene Vent, George Freis, and Kevin Pease walked out of prison. Their convictions were vacated. They were free. But I want to be honest about the shape of that freedom, because it was not the clean vindication it should have been. The release came through a settlement, and the terms of that settlement were hard. As a condition of being let out, the men agreed not to sue the city over what had been done to them, and the state of Alaska was careful to say, on its way out the door, that this was not a formal exoneration. It was, in the state's words, a compromise, an acknowledgement only that if the men were tried again today, it was not clear they would be convicted, which is a very lawyerly way of avoiding the plain sentence that 4 native leaders and half the state had been saying for 18 years. These men did not do it. Years later, the men fought that no-sue agreement, arguing they had signed it under coercion with their freedom held as the price. The courts ultimately sided with them. 3 of them reached settlements of around $1.5 million each, and in the end, Marvin Roberts, the last of the 4 to settle, reached an agreement with the city of Fairbanks for $11.5 million. As he put it himself, no amount of money would ever be enough to justify what he endured as an innocent man in prison. What it gave him was not justice. It gave him time, more time with his daughter and with the parents who had believed him through the whole long nightmare. And here is the part that should stay with you, because it is the quiet tragedy underneath the louder one. Remember John Hartman. Remember the 15-year-old boy beaten to death on a Fairbanks street, the victim at the very center of all of this. To this day, the Fairbanks police still list his killing as open and active, which is to say, whoever actually killed John Hartman was never brought to justice for it, because for 18 years, everyone believed the case was already solved. The rush to convict 4 innocent men did not only steal 18 years from those 4 men, It stole John Hartman's justice too. It let the truth of what happened to him go cold while the wrong people paid for it. Two injustices from one mistake, and neither one of them has ever really been made right. There is one more Alaska case we need to sit with before the night is over, and it lives in the space between these two kinds of failure, because sometimes the system does catch the right man and then lets him go anyway, and the cost of that mistake is not 18 stolen years. The cost is another life. To understand that, we have to talk about a woman named Della Brown and about what happened after the man who killed her walked free. Della Brown was 33 years old, and she was, like too many of the people in tonight's stories, a woman the world had already decided not to watch over. She was Alaska native. She struggled with addiction, with alcohol, and with drugs, the kind of struggle that makes a person invisible to a certain sort of gaze that lets people look right through you as though your life is worth a little less than theirs. It was not. Della Brown was somebody. She had a family who loved her, a name, a life that was hers, but she lived in the margins of Anchorage, in the Spenard neighborhood, in the part of a city where a person can slip out of view and no alarm is raised. In September of 2000, a young man named Joshua Wade came across Della Brown, and he robbed her, and he assaulted her, and he killed her in a shed in Anchorage. I am not going to describe her injuries. They were terrible, and the details have been printed enough times, and Della is owed better than to be reduced to them one more time. What matters is what happened after, because what happened after is one of the most disturbing things in any case we have talked about tonight, and it has nothing to do with the killer at all. For days, Della Brown's body lay in that shed, and people knew. Word went around the neighborhood, the way word does, that there was a body in the shed, and people came to look, not to help, and not to call for help. They came to see, filing through, some of them lighting matches in the dark to get a better view of her, and then they left, and they said nothing to anyone with a badge. Have you ever wondered what it says about how we sort human beings into the ones who matter and the ones who don't? That a woman could lie dead in a shed while her neighbors treated her like a sideshow, and not one of them, for days, thought her worth a phone call. Della Brown was failed by her killer, yes, but she was failed again and again by every single person who walked through that shed and decided her death was not their business. Eventually, someone who had seen the body did report it, and the investigation led to Joshua Wade. And in 2003, he stood trial for Della Brown's murder. The trouble was the evidence, or rather, the lack of it. Physical evidence tying Wade to the killing was thin. Much of what pointed at him came from his own mouth, from the way he had reportedly bragged about the crime to friends, and from those friends repeating it. But Wade's defense had an answer for that, and it was a clever one. They painted him as a big talker, a young man so desperate to impress a rough crowd that he would claim anything, take credit for anything, to seem dangerous. And the friends who could have sunk him were themselves people with criminal records, easy for a defense to wave away as unreliable. So the jury was left with a braggart, a handful of shaky witnesses, and very little hard evidence. And they did what a jury is supposed to do when the state has not met its burden. They acquitted him. Wade was found not guilty of murdering Della Brown, not guilty of sexually assaulting her, not guilty of robbing her. Out of everything the state charged him with, only one thing stuck, a single count of tampering with evidence, And for that, he was sentenced to 6.5 years. Within about a year, he was out on probation. Some of the jurors would say later that they had never felt comfortable with that verdict. They had a bad feeling about Wade, but a bad feeling is not proof, and the system, correctly, does not convict people on bad feelings. The evidence was not there, and so Joshua Wade walked out, a free man, with the state's own failure to build a case now standing between him and any consequence for what he had done to Della Brown. Keep that acquittal in your mind, because everything that happens next flows directly out of it. Della Brown's killer was free, and a few years later, that freedom would put him on the other side of a bedroom wall from a woman named Mindy Schloss. Mindy Schloss was 52 years old, and she was building the good part of her life. She was a nurse practitioner, someone who worked in mental health, the kind of skilled professional that a place like Alaska never has enough of. For years she had commuted long distances, all the way to Fairbanks, doing demanding work for other people's practices. And now, finally, she was about to work for herself. She had signed a lease on an office in Anchorage. She was going to open her own practice, be her own boss, do the work she loved on her own terms. She was, by every account, warm and ambitious and well-liked, a woman with a wide, easy smile who was standing right at the threshold of everything she had worked toward. She lived in a quiet neighborhood in the Sand Lake area of Anchorage, and in 2007, after finishing his probation, Joshua Wade moved into the house next door. His bedroom window looked into her kitchen. Mindy Schloss had no way of knowing who her new neighbor was. She did not know that a jury had once been asked whether he had beaten a woman to death and had let him go on a technicality of insufficient evidence. To her, he was just the man next door. That is the quiet horror of what the acquittal set in motion. The system's failure to hold Wade accountable for Della Brown was not an abstract injustice filed away in a courthouse. It was a loaded thing sitting next door to an unsuspecting woman, waiting. In the first days of August of 2007, Wade was in a bad way, broke and unhappy, sent home from his job. He had illegally gotten hold of a handgun despite being a convicted felon, and one night he crossed the small distance between the two houses, forced his way into Mindy Schloss's home, and restrained her with zip ties. He took her bank card and her PIN number, and then he put her, alive, bound, wearing only a bathrobe, into the back of her own car and drove her away from her home and killed her, shot in the back of the head, and left her body out beyond the edge of the city. This time, he did not get away with it. Mindy Schloss's car turned up abandoned at an Anchorage airport, and a man resembling Wade had been seen leaving it. Investigators ruled out the people closest to her and turned to the neighbors, and Wade, with his record and his history, drew their attention fast. Two of his former girlfriends identified him from surveillance images. By the time police came for him, he had run. There was a manhunt. It ended with Wade holed up in an acquaintance's house, holding people at gunpoint, until a negotiation talked him into surrendering. Because Mindy Schloss had been forced into her own car and driven to her death, the federal government could charge Wade with a carjacking that resulted in a death, and that charge, unlike anything in the Alaska courts, carried the possibility of a death sentence. Faced with that, Wade made a deal. In 2010, he pleaded guilty and accepted a state sentence of 99 years and a federal sentence of life, one stacked on top of the other. so that he would never be released. And as part of that deal, he did the thing that the Della Brown jury had been unable to do for her. He confessed. He admitted in open court that he had murdered Della Brown in 2000, the killing a jury had acquitted him of years before. He could not be tried for it again. But his confession let the judge close the door on any chance of parole, and it gave Della Brown's family the one thing the first trial had denied them: the truth said out loud, at last, in his own voice. There was more, and it came later. In 2014, in exchange for a transfer to a prison outside Alaska, Wade confessed to still more killings, reaching all the way back to 1994, when he was only 14. He named among his victims 2 men who lived with mental illness, men who, like Della Brown, existed in the margins where society does not look closely. Investigators took his claims seriously, though they were not equally certain of all of them. Joshua Wade died in prison in 2024, having spent the rest of his life exactly where he belonged. But think about the shape of it. Della Brown was killed, and because the evidence was thin, and because she was who she was, her killer walked free. And that freedom, that single failure to convict, is the reason Mindy Schloss died. If the system had held Joshua Wade for Della Brown, he would not have been next door to Mindy Schloss 7 years later. It is the same lesson Bonnie Craig's case taught us, only crueler for how clearly you can trace the line. When we fail one victim, we are very often failing a future, one we have not met yet. Della Brown and Mindy Schloss could not have been more different, a struggling woman in Spenard and a successful nurse in Sand Lake, and they were joined forever by one man who should never have been free to reach the second one. Notice, before we move on, who keeps being chosen in these stories. The woman with an addiction, the dancer, the traveler with no family nearby. Again and again, the people who end up as victims are the ones the world watches a little less carefully, the ones who are a little more alone, a little more trusting, a little easier to reach, and in our own time. There is a new doorway straight into that vulnerability, one that did not exist for most of tonight's cases. It is the phone in your pocket. It is the stranger who can become, in a matter of weeks, the most important voice in a lonely person's life. To see what that can do, we only have to go back a few years to a young woman named Cynthia Hoffman. Cynthia Hoffman was 19 years old, and to the people who loved her, she was Cece. She lived in Anchorage. She had a developmental disability, one that, as her family would gently explain, left her at a younger developmental age than her years, more trusting than a 19-year-old, more open, less able to sense when someone meant her harm. Her father, Timothy, adored her, and Cynthia had a best friend, a young woman she trusted completely, a young woman named Denali Bramer. That trust is the hinge on which this entire tragedy turns. What Cynthia could not have known was that her best friend had, in the weeks before, fallen into an online relationship with a man she believed was a wealthy stranger named Tyler, a millionaire from Kansas. In reality, there was no Tyler. The man on the other end of those messages was named Darin Schillmiller, and he was a young man in Indiana, thousands of miles from Alaska, who had invented the whole persona to manipulate the people he talked to. He was not wealthy. He was a manipulator working entirely through a screen, hunting for someone he could bend to his will. And he made Bramer an offer that should have been unthinkable, that he would pay her millions of dollars if she would kill someone in Alaska and send him the images of it. He did not even have the money. It was all a fantasy of control. And she believed it, and she agreed. Schillmiller chose the victim. He told her to kill Cynthia Hoffman. On the 2nd of June, 2019, Cynthia was told they were all going on a hike out to Thunderbird Falls, a popular and beautiful spot north of Anchorage. She went because her best friend asked her to. She had no reason in the world to be afraid. And there, by the Eklutna River, the people she trusted turned on her. She was bound, and she was shot, and her body was placed into the river. As it happened, images were sent to the man in Indiana who had ordered it. And then, in the coldest detail of an already cold story, the group texted Cynthia's parents to tell them they had simply dropped her off at a park, buying themselves time while her family began, frantically, to look for her. It did not stay hidden for long, and the reason it unraveled says something small and good about human beings in the middle of something so dark. Denali Bramer's own biological mother, who had only recently come back into her daughter's life, heard from her a story so strange and so terrible that she did not know what to believe. And then she saw Cynthia's father on the local news, pleading for help finding his missing daughter. And she could not carry it. She went to the police because, as she later said, she could not in good conscience stay silent. Cynthia's body was found the day after she was reported missing. What followed was a wave of prosecutions. Darin Schillmiller, the man who had orchestrated it all from another state, was eventually extradited to Alaska, pleaded guilty to soliciting the murder, and was sentenced to 99 years. He also admitted, separately, to federal crimes involving the exploitation of a minor, which tells you the full measure of what he was. Denali Bramer, the best friend, pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and was likewise sentenced to 99 years, the judge noting that while she had not fired the shot, none of it would ever have happened without her. Another young man who supplied a vehicle for the promise of money pleaded guilty as well, and a fourth young person, alleged to have been the one who actually fired the shot, and who was only 16 at the time, was charged to be tried as an adult, and under our system he is presumed innocent unless and until that is proven. The judge who handled the case called it what it was: a premeditated murder for hire, tragic and senseless, one of the most difficult things he had ever had to sit through. But strip away the machinery of the courts, and what you are left with is unbearably simple. A trusting young woman was told she was going on a hike with her best friend, and she was killed for a payment that did not even exist, arranged by a stranger she had never met, working through a phone. Cynthia Hoffman was chosen for the very same reason so many of tonight's victims were chosen, because someone decided her trust made her easy. Her father has spent every day since making sure the world remembers that Cece was a person beloved and whole, and not the thing that was done to her. The same patient science that finally spoke for Sophie Sergey and for Bonnie Craig has one more story to tell tonight, and it carries inside it a quiet echo of the mistake we saw earlier swallow 4 innocent men in Fairbanks. Because before this next case was solved, it too came very close to ruining the wrong life entirely. Jessica Bagan had just turned 17. The day before, in fact. She was what the people of her town would later call, with real affection, a true Sitka kid. Sitka is a small harbor town in southeast Alaska, a place of 8,000 people or so, tucked between the mountains and the sea, the kind of town where there is almost no serious crime and everyone knows everyone. Jessica belonged to it completely. She loved to fish, she loved to cook, and her family remembered her at the center of their Thanksgiving pie-making marathons with Willie Nelson playing in the background. She had a plan for her life, too. She wanted to leave Alaska to study photography down in Arizona. She was 17 years old, and she was just getting started. On the night of the 4th of May, 1996, Jessica celebrated her birthday at her sister's house, and then, sometime after midnight, she set off to walk home. It was only about a mile. In a town like Sitka, on an ordinary night, a mile is nothing. But Jessica never made it home. When she missed her curfew, her parents waited, the way parents do, telling themselves she had simply lost track of time on her birthday. And then, when the hours kept passing, that hope curdled into fear, and they called the police. 2 days later, searchers found her body in the woods near a bike path, not far from the college campus, hidden in a shallow, hastily dug hollow beneath a fallen tree. She had been sexually assaulted and killed, and the small, safe town of Sitka, which had almost no memory of anything like this, went into shock. Police held community meetings just to calm frightened residents. Everyone wanted the person responsible found, and found fast. And that need for a fast answer is where this case nearly became a different kind of tragedy. Within a week of Jessica's death, a local man confessed. He was a maintenance worker at the nearby college, a man with intellectual disabilities, a vulnerable person who, under the pressure of interrogation, told the police what they were desperate to hear. There was no physical evidence connecting him to Jessica at all. His public defender would later demonstrate that his confession had been coerced, pulled out of a man who did not fully understand what was happening to him. He was tried, and he was acquitted. But think about how close that came. In their anxiety to solve the killing of a beloved teenager, investigators had centered on exactly the kind of vulnerable person who ends up paying for other people's crimes, the same pattern we just watched play out with 4 young men in Fairbanks. And there is a harder cost still, because the years spent looking at the wrong man were years not spent looking for the right one. So the case went cold. It stayed cold for 24 years. Jessica's family never let it go, and neither, it turned out, did others. In one of those quiet threads that ties this whole night together, the very fund that Bonnie Craig's family had started to help solve Alaska cold cases placed Jessica Baggins' murder on its list of priorities. These families, separated by hundreds of miles and years of grief, were reaching across to one another in the dark. And then, just as it had for Sophie and for Bonnie, the science caught up. Beginning around 2018, Alaska's small cold case unit applied genetic genealogy to the DNA that had been preserved from Jessica's case all those years. They built a family tree out of the genetic traces of distant relatives, and it led them, at last, to a name. A man named Steve Branch, who had lived in Sitka at the time of Jessica's murder, and who had since moved thousands of miles away to a small town in Arkansas. And when investigators looked closer, they found something that made the blood run cold. Only weeks before Jessica was killed, that same man had been investigated in Sitka for sexually assaulting another teenage girl. He had been acquitted of that too, and then he had quietly moved on and moved away and lived the next 2 decades as a free man. In the summer of 2020, investigators flew to Arkansas and knocked on his door. They told him why they were there. He denied everything, and he refused to give them a sample of his DNA. So they left to go and get a warrant that would compel it. And about half an hour after they walked out of his house, Steve Branch took his own life. The warrant was carried out anyway at his autopsy, and the DNA came back a match. Jessica Baggins' case was, after 24 years, finally solved. Though her killer would never sit in a courtroom and never answer to a jury, Jessica, had she lived, would have been turning 41. Her case had an ending of a kind, a name, a certainty, an answer for a family that had waited a quarter of a century for one. But not every Alaska answer stays put once you have it. Some of them arrive and settle in and let a family believe the story is finally closed, and then, years later, they simply come apart in a courtroom. To understand what that does to the people left behind, we have to talk about a fisherman named Kent Leppink. Kent Leppink was 36 years old, and by all accounts he was a man who loved with his whole chest, completely and without much caution. He had come up to Alaska from Michigan to work as a fisherman, the way so many people come to Alaska, chasing a harder and cleaner version of life. And somewhere along the way he met a young woman, a dancer then known as Michelle Hughes, and he fell for her utterly. He proposed after only about a month. He told his whole family about her. He believed with everything in him that they were engaged and that a life together was coming. What Kent may not have fully understood was how complicated the situation around him truly was. The young woman he loved was involved, at various times, with more than one man, among them Kent, a man named John Carlin, and another man named Scott Hilker. For a stretch, some of them even shared the same house in Anchorage. Kent's family grew alarmed. His mother would later describe the moment he told her that his fiancée's grandfather had, as a wedding gift, taken out a life insurance policy on Kent's life worth $1 million. She thought it made no sense at all, and she begged her son to get out, to walk away, that he was in some kind of danger he could not see. In the days before his death, something seems to have shifted for Kent as well. He changed the beneficiary on that insurance policy, moving it to his own father. And he did one more thing, a thing that would hang over this case for the next 2 decades. He wrote a letter to his parents with instructions that it should only be opened if he died under suspicious circumstances. In it, he named the people he believed would be responsible if anything happened to him. On the 2nd of May, 1996, Kent Leppink was found shot to death on a remote trail near the small community of Hope, about 90 miles south of Anchorage. He had, it appeared, been lured out there by word of a cabin that, in the end, did not exist, and so his letter was opened, and it read like a voice speaking from beyond, pointing at the very people closest to him. For years, that was all there was. The case went cold. It was not until around 2004, when Alaska troopers reopened it with new resources, that it moved again. Investigators gathered old emails and new testimony, and in 2006 and 2007, John Carlin and Michelle Linehan, as she was now known, having become a suburban wife and mother, married to a doctor, were both convicted of murdering Kent Leppink. The theory was that she had wanted the insurance money and had drawn Carlin into killing for her. Linehan was sentenced to 99 years, and for a moment, the Leppink family had their answer. But it did not hold. The case against both of them had been built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence and on appeal. The courts took a hard look at how that evidence, had been presented. The judges concluded that two things had unfairly tipped the scales: the letter Kent had written from beyond the grave, and testimony about a film, a thriller about a woman who talks a man into killing for money, which the prosecution had used to paint a picture of Linehan's character. The appeals court ruled that this kind of evidence was too prejudicial in a case with so little hard proof, and it overturned the convictions. John Carlin never saw the end of it because he had already died, killed in his prison cell, while his own appeal was still pending. The murder charge against Michelle Linehan was ultimately dismissed, and prosecutors decided not to try her a second time. She has always maintained her innocence, and in the eyes of the law today, she stands not convicted of anything, which leaves Kent Lepink, a man who loved someone with everything he had, lying on a trail near hope, and a case that was solved and then unsolved, and that now belongs to no one. His family had the answer in their hands and then watched it dissolve. There is a particular cruelty in that, an answer given and then taken back, that is almost harder than never having had one at all. And it is a fitting place to cross over, because from here to the end of the night, we leave the world of answers entirely. Every case we have sat with tonight, however long it took and however imperfect the outcome, eventually gave up something, a name or a conviction or a confession, or at least a grave. Alaska, in the end, let go of an answer. But Alaska does not always let go. For the rest of our time together, we are going to sit with the ones where the cold kept everything and gave nothing back, where there was no arrest, no trial, no verdict, and in some cases, not even a body to lay to rest. And we begin with the two youngest people in this entire story. Scott Fandel was 13 years old. His little sister, Amy, was 8. They lived with their mother, Margaret, in a small 2-room cabin outside the town of Sterling on the Kenai Peninsula, in a quiet, wooded, ordinary place where nothing was supposed to happen. Their parents had gone through a hard divorce, and their father had moved down to Arizona. Money was thin, and Scott, being the older of the two, had grown into the role of looking after his sister. By every account, he took it seriously. He was a bit of a prankster, a normal 13-year-old boy, but he was fiercely protective of Amy. Whatever happened that night, it is almost impossible to imagine Scott simply leaving her behind. On the evening of the 4th of September, 1978, Margaret and her visiting sister, Kathy, took the two children out to a local bar and restaurant called Good Time Charlie's. The kids played arcade games while the adults visited. Around 10 o'clock, the children were dropped back at the cabin, and the two women went back out for the night. Scott and Amy went over to the neighbors, a family called the Luptons, whose children were their close friends, the kind of friends they walked to the bus stop with every morning. They played until nearly 1:45, when the Luptons decided the kids were getting too loud and sent Scott and Amy back home. A neighbor passing by noticed the lights on in the Fandel cabin at around that time. That is the last that anyone can place them with any certainty. Two children in their own home on an ordinary night with the lights on. When Margaret and Kathy came home in the early hours of the morning, they walked into a scene that has haunted this case for almost 50 years. On the stove sat a pot of water. On the counter were a box of macaroni and an opened can of tomatoes. Scott, it seemed, had been standing right there, making himself a late-night snack, the most ordinary thing a hungry teenager does when something interrupted him. but the children were not there. Margaret, exhausted, seems to have assumed they had gone to bed and went to sleep herself. In the morning, finding them gone, she assumed they had simply left early for school. It was not until that afternoon, when they did not come home, and when the Lupton kids came by looking for their friends to play, that the full weight of it landed, and Margaret called the troopers in a panic. And here is what makes this one sit so heavily. When investigators looked at that cabin, they found a scene that pointed nowhere and everywhere at once. There were no signs of a struggle, nothing broken, no blood, nothing to suggest violence, but there was also nothing to suggest the children had left on their own. Their shoes were still inside. Their coats were still inside. And this was Alaska, in September, where the nights were already cold. Both children were known to be afraid of the dark. Neither of them would have walked out into a black Alaskan night with no shoes and no coat, willingly, leaving a snack half-made on the counter. The cabin's door lock, some accounts say, was broken, and outside, investigators found spent bullet casings, though they could never determine whether those had anything to do with the children at all. What followed was an enormous effort. The community and the troopers combed the woods. Search dogs were brought in from Anchorage. Authorities watched the ferries and asked the Canadian border to be alert for anyone crossing with two children. Hundreds of leads came in over the years, and investigators chased all of them. Suspicion fell at various times in various directions. Some believed the children had been abducted by a stranger, perhaps someone who had overheard at the bar that they would be home alone. Some looked hard at the children's father down in Arizona. He flew up to help with the search, and he was considered a person of interest for many years, though he was never charged, and investigators eventually came to believe he was not involved. There was a strange, ugly footnote years later, when a woman who had reportedly been his girlfriend at the time allegedly offered to tell a relative what had happened to the children for $5,000. Nothing ever came of it. There was talk of two carnival workers whose vehicle had been seen near the cabin, but that too led nowhere, and no one was ever charged with anything. The cabin itself burned down some years later, taking whatever secrets it still held. The bodies of Scott and Amy Fandel have never been found. Not a trace of either child has ever been recovered anywhere in nearly 50 years. Their mother, in one of her rare interviews, said the thing that so many families in tonight's stories could have said. "We were just an ordinary family," she said. Then, in a blink, everything was gone. Scott would be a man in his 60s now. Amy would be in her 50s. And somewhere, a former trooper who worked the case still calls it the one that never let him go. The two kids who walked home on an ordinary night and simply were not there in the morning. From the two youngest people in our story, we move now to a young mother, and we travel far to the west, out to the edge of the continent, to a town we have already spent time in tonight, because the not knowing that has held the Fandel family for almost 50 years is the same not knowing that right now, tonight, holds another Alaska family. And it brings us back to Nome. You will remember Nome from Sonia Ivanov's story, the small town on the Bering Sea coast, the end of the road, the finish line of the old Gold Rush Trail. Hold that town in your mind, and hold Sonia in your mind too, because what I am about to tell you happened in the same town, and it is going to rhyme with her story in ways that should trouble us. Florence Ogpeluk was 33 years old. She was Inupiaq from the village of Wales, a tiny community about 100 miles northwest of Nome, way out where Alaska reaches toward Russia across the Bering Strait. She was the second youngest in a large family, and to the people who loved her, she was Flo, or baby Florrie. Her younger sister remembered that Florence was the one child among all the girls in the family with the patience and the dedication to truly learn the old ways, that she had gotten her first ulu, the traditional cutting knife, when she was only about 6. In 2013, pregnant with her daughter, Florence moved into Nome, hoping to give her child better access to healthcare and schooling. And there she went to work at the Norton Sound Health Corporation. Sit with that for a moment. Sonia Ivanov, 19 years old, worked at the Norton Sound Regional Hospital in Nome and was murdered in 2003. Florence Okpeluk, a young mother, worked for that same Nome health system and vanished in 2020. 2 Alaska Native women, 1 town, 1 small institution, 17 years apart. Florence loved her daughter fiercely, shared custody of her, and took joy in passing on the native traditions she had worked so hard to learn. Like many people, she also struggled at times, in her case with alcohol, and I want to be careful with that detail because of how it would later be used against her, the way it is so often used against Indigenous women who go missing, as a reason to shrug and look away. On the last day of August in 2020, Florence was at West Beach, a stretch of shoreline a mile or 2 outside Nome, where gold miners still camp in tents through the short northern summer, working the same beaches men have worked for over a century. She was last seen in the late afternoon, coming out of one of those tents, and then she was gone. She left her jacket behind, and her shoes, and her socks, right there at the tent. She never came home to her daughter. She has never been seen or heard from again. Her family reported her missing that same evening, and what followed was, to the credit of that small community, an enormous and sustained effort. The Nome Police Department, a tiny force of only 6 or 7 officers, called in the FBI, the Alaska State Troopers, the Volunteer Fire Department Search and Rescue Team, and the Coast Guard. They searched with dogs, from the air, by boat, and even with underwater drones in the nearby ponds. Neighbors and strangers came from villages all across the region, from Teller and Brevig Mission and Wales and Savunga, to walk the brush and comb the beach. And in all of it, all they ever found were the things she had left behind at that tent, her shoes and her jacket, and nothing more. Foul play is suspected, and the case remains open and unsolved to this day. But listen to what her friends had to fight against, even as they searched. Again and again, people suggested that Florence had simply taken off, that she had wandered away, that she had chosen to start a new life somewhere else. It is the same easy story that gets told about so many missing Indigenous women, the story that lets a community stop looking. And the people who loved her refused it. She had a young daughter, they said, a little girl she would never in 1,000 years have abandoned. One of her friends put it as plainly as it can be put. Flo, she said, was not just somebody. She was an Indigenous woman, and she mattered, and she's still missing. Remember the weight I asked you to carry at the very beginning of tonight, the fact that Indigenous women in Alaska are murdered and go missing at rates many times higher than anyone else in the state. Florence Okpeluk is not a statistic in that number. She is a face on a poster all over Nome, a daughter, a sister, and a mother whose little girl is growing up without her, while somewhere out there, as one of her friends said, There are people who know what happened. Her family is still waiting. They have been waiting for years now, in the same town where Sonia Ivanov's family once waited, for an answer that has never come. From a young woman who walked into the dark off a beach, we turn to a young man who went out onto the water and never came back, because the sea in Alaska keeps its secrets every bit as well as the cold does, and it took a 17-year-old boy named Wade Tackett and gave almost nothing back. In the summer of 1986, Wade Tackett was 17 years old and working a summer job in Pelican, a tiny fishing community tucked into the forested coastline of southeast Alaska, the kind of place you can only reach by boat or by float plane. For a teenager from Ohio, it must have felt like the edge of the world in the best possible way, a summer of water and mountains and hard, honest work. On the 11th of June, the weather was sunny and calm, and there was not much work to do. So Wade and a friend took a small skiff, only about 14 feet long, out to explore. They hiked to an old mine, they had a picnic, and then, by the friend's account, Wade decided to take the skiff out on his own to poke around the inlet a little more while his friend stayed on shore. It was an ordinary thing to do. On an ordinary, calm day, in water these young men had been working all summer. Wade never came back. After an hour or two, his friend flagged down a passing boat, and together they went looking, and they found the skiff not far away, less than a mile off, nosed up against the shore. But the scene of it was strange, and it has troubled people ever since. The throttle was pushed nearly wide open, and the engine had died. Wade was not in the boat. The Coast Guard was called, and searchers combed the shoreline and the water that evening and into the following days. All they ever found was a single oar. Of Wade Tackett himself, there was no trace at all. The Alaska State Troopers came to the conclusion that the likeliest explanation was the simplest and the saddest one, that Wade had somehow gone over the side of that little skiff into the cold water and drowned, and that the sea had carried him away. And you will remember, from the very start of tonight, what that cold water does, how it pulls the warmth from a body many times faster than cold air, how quickly it can turn a strong young swimmer into someone who cannot save himself. In all likelihood, that is exactly what happened. A calm day, a small boat, a moment's accident, and the water did the rest. But here is the thing about a disappearance with no body. It does not let the people who love that person rest inside the likeliest answer. Wade's parents, Virgil and Mary, flew up from Ohio about a week after he vanished, and they could not accept the drowning conclusion. They suspected foul play. They clung to the hope, as parents do, that their son was somehow still alive out there. And they spent years fighting for their boy, writing letters to their congressman, to the governor of Alaska, to the United States Attorney General, pushing for the FBI to get involved, talking to reporters, keeping Wade's name alive in newspapers long after the official file had gone quiet. Decades later, a book was written about a mother's long search for her missing son, and it pulled Wade's story back into the light. To this day, Wade Tackett's face is still there among the Alaska State Troopers' bulletins of the missing, a 17-year-old boy from the summer of 1986, still officially not found. Whether Wade drowned on a calm afternoon or something darker happened out on that water, no one can now say for certain, and that uncertainty is its own kind of wound. His mother spent the rest of her life unable to close a door that the water had left standing open. That is what a body denied does to a family. It takes the grief that should have a shape and leaves it formless, stretching on and on, with no grave to kneel beside and no final answer to hold. Which brings us, at the very end of the night, to the largest and most famous of all Alaska's vanishings, a case where not one person but 4 disappeared at once, in an instant, into a sky that has never given them back. Let's talk about the flight that vanished. There were 4 of them on the plane, and history mostly remembers 2. So let's begin by making sure all 4 of them are here. The most famous was Hale Boggs. He was 58 years old, a congressman from Louisiana, and not just any congressman. He was the House Majority Leader, one of the most senior figures in the entire United States Congress, a man many expected would become the next Speaker of the House. He had served on the Warren Commission, the body that investigated the assassination of President Kennedy. He was seasoned, influential, nationally known, the kind of man whose disappearance would stop the whole country in its tracks. He had a wife, Lindy, and a family waiting for him back home. Beside him was Nick Begich. He was 40 years old, and he was Alaska's only member of the House of Representatives, the single voice for the entire enormous state in that chamber. He was in the middle of a tough re-election campaign, and Boggs had flown up to Alaska to barnstorm for him, to help the younger man hold his seat. Begich was a family man in the fullest sense of the phrase. He and his wife, Begich, had 6 children. 6. Picture that house, and picture what was about to be taken from it. The third man was Russell Brown. He was 37, and he was Nick Begich's aide, his administrative assistant, the sort of person who makes a congressman's life run and whose name almost never makes the headline. He was younger than the 2 men he served, with his whole life still ahead of him, and he climbed onto that plane because it was his job to be where his boss was. And the 4th was the pilot, Don Johns. He was 38, out of Fairbanks, and by every account a genuine character. He had changed his own name earlier in life. He owned the small charter company that operated the flight, and he was, on paper, enormously experienced, with something like 17,000 hours in the air behind him. Only a few weeks before this flight, he had written an article for a flying magazine, and of all the subjects in the world, the article was about flying safely through icing conditions. He had titled it, without a trace of irony that anyone could have known to feel at the time, Ice Without Fear. On the morning of the 16th of October, 1972, these 4 men boarded a small twin-engine plane, a Cessna, at the airport in Anchorage. Their destination was Juneau, the state capital, down in the southeast, where a campaign event for Begich was waiting. It is a flight of a few hours over some of the most rugged and beautiful and unforgiving country on the continent, mountains and glaciers and the cold water of the Sound, the kind of route Alaska pilots fly all the time and respect every single time. They lifted off at around 9 in the morning, and then, almost immediately, they were simply part of the sky. The last anyone heard from the plane came just a few minutes after takeoff, a routine radio call. The pilot reporting the ordinary things a pilot reports: 4 souls on board, 6 hours of fuel. When asked whether they had emergency gear aboard, the pilot answered that they did, and that was it. That was the last human contact with Hale Boggs, Nick Begich, Russell Brown, and Don Johns. The plane flew on toward Juneau, into weather and mountains, and it never arrived, and it was never heard from again. When a plane carrying the House Majority Leader of the United States goes missing, the response is not an ordinary search. What followed became the largest search and rescue operation in American history up to that time. And it is worth letting the scale of it land because it tells you everything about how hard this country tried and how completely the land refused to give anything back. The military threw in around 40 aircraft. Roughly 50 civilian planes joined them. The Coast Guard, the Navy, the Army, the Air Force, the Civil Air Patrol, and countless volunteers all took part. At one point, even a high-altitude spy plane was pressed into the effort. Search crews covered a grid of something like 325,000 square miles, an area larger than most countries, and logged more than 3,600 hours in the air, scanning the mountains and the water and the endless trees. For 39 days they looked, and in 39 days, across all that territory, with all those aircraft and all those eyes, they found nothing at all. No wreckage, no debris on the water, no emergency signal, no sign anywhere of the plane or of the 4 men who had been inside it. On the 24th of November, 1972, the search was finally suspended. And on the 29th of December, Hale Boggs, Nick Begich, Russell Brown, and Don Johns were all officially declared dead, without a single physical trace of any of them ever having been recovered. They are still out there, somewhere, in that country. More than 50 years later, they have never been found. So what happened to them? And the honest answer, the one this whole channel is built on being willing to say plainly, is that we do not know. But there are theories, and they are worth walking through because they run the full range from the sadly ordinary to the wildly conspiratorial. The most likely explanation, the one favored by most people who have studied it seriously, is also the least dramatic: weather. The route from Anchorage to Juneau runs through mountain country where conditions change fast, and October is late enough in the year that ice becomes a real danger. A small plane picking up ice on its wings in cloud in the mountains can go from flying to falling very quickly. There is a bitter irony in it, given that the pilot had just written an article about flying through ice without fear. And once a plane goes down in that country, the same forces we talked about at the very beginning of tonight take over. Glaciers with crevasses hundreds of feet deep, dense forest that closes over a wreck within a season. Cold, deep water. The land does not just hide a downed plane out there, it digests it. A crash in the wrong valley or the wrong stretch of sound could vanish as completely as if it had never happened, which, as far as the searchers could tell, is exactly what it did. There is a small, strange piece of this that changed the law for everyone who has flown since. At the time, that plane was not required to carry an emergency locator transmitter, a device that automatically sends out a signal when a plane goes down, the very thing that might have led searchers straight to the wreckage. Because of this disappearance, because 4 men, including the House Majority Leader, vanished with no way to signal where they had fallen, the country changed the rules the following year and began requiring those transmitters. Every pilot who has ever been found because of an emergency beacon owes that safety, in part, to a plane that was never found at all. Now, because 2 of the men on board were prominent national politicians, and because one of them had sat on the Warren Commission, the disappearance became a magnet for darker theories, and we should walk through them, if only to be fair, and then set them in their place. Over the years, some have suggested that Hale Boggs was deliberately killed, that the plane was sabotaged, that dangerous enemies wanted him gone. Decades later, a man who was himself a convicted murderer and who had briefly been married to Nick Begich's widow, claimed that the plane had been brought down by a bomb planted by organized crime. That claim helped fuel a modern investigation and a popular podcast that re-examined the whole case. But we have to be careful and honest here, in the way we have tried to be all night. The central bomb claim came from a convicted killer years after the fact, and it is riddled with holes that even the journalists most interested in the case have acknowledged. There is no physical evidence of a bomb, because there is no physical evidence of anything. That is the whole problem. When you have found nothing, you can project almost any story onto the emptiness, and grief and suspicion will always reach for a reason, because a reason, even a terrible one, is easier to hold than pure, blank absence. The most grounded voices on this case, including members of Boggs's own family, have tended to land in the same place. The real mystery is not some elaborate assassination plot. The real mystery is simply that in all these years, with all that searching, not one trace of these four men has ever been found. And there are threads that keep that mystery alive in a quieter, more honest way. Some years after the disappearance, a fisherman reported finding the tail section of a small plane, matching the color and description of the missing Cessna, out near Hinchinbrook Island at the entrance to Prince William Sound. Working from clues like that one, investigators and journalists have narrowed the likely crash area down to a relatively small stretch of country, small enough that, with modern technology and with glaciers now melting and giving up their old secrets, a real search might finally succeed. On the 50th anniversary of the disappearance, Hale Boggs's own grandson publicly called for exactly that, a renewed search, arguing that after half a century, it is time to bring these men home. The world moved on, the way it has to. Both congressmen were, remarkably, re-elected by their constituents that November, weeks after they vanished, before anyone was willing to accept that they were gone. In the special elections that followed, Hale Boggs's seat went to his wife, Lindy, who would go on to serve in Congress for years in her own right, a formidable figure entirely apart from her husband. And in Alaska, the seat that Nick Begich had been fighting to keep went to the very man he had been running against, Don Young, who would then hold that single Alaska seat for nearly half a century, one of the longest careers in the history of the Congress. History rerouted itself around the hole these men left the way a river reroutes around a stone, but the families did not get to move on the way the country did. Nick Begich's 6 children grew up not only without their father, but without the small mercy of a grave to visit, a place to lay a flower the way Eleanor Sergi laid a carnation in the Chena River for Sophie. There was no body, there was no wreck, there was only a last radio call on an autumn morning and then more than 50 years of sky. Have you ever wondered which is harder in the end, the terrible answer or no answer at all? Because tonight we have seen both, and I am not sure the families of these 4 men, half a century on, could tell you. We have covered a lot of ground tonight, across a lot of years and a lot of cold Alaska miles, so before we let it go, let's bring it back to where it always belongs, which is to the people. Where these cases stand today is a mix of answered and unanswered, and it is worth saying plainly. Sophie Sergei's killer was found after a quarter of a century and convicted, though the appeals go on. Bonnie Craig's killer was identified by the same patient science and is serving more than a century in prison. Sonia Ivanov's killer, the officer who was supposed to protect her, will die behind bars, and the state passed a law in her name. The women Robert Hansen hunted finally have a measure of justice, though 5 of them were never recovered, and at least 2 have never even been given back their names. The Fairbanks 4 are free, but not formally exonerated, and John Hartman's real killer has never answered for what was done to that 15-year-old boy. Joshua Wade confessed at last to Della Brown and to Mindy Schloss and to others, and died in a cell. Cynthia Hoffman's killers were caught within days and will spend their lives in prison, though nothing will ever undo the betrayal at the center of it. Jessica Bagan's killer was named at last by the same patient science a quarter of a century on, though he answered to no jury. Kent Leppink's case was solved, and then, on appeal, unsolved again, so that today no one at all stands convicted of his murder. Scott and Amy Fandel, a boy and his little sister, have been gone for nearly 50 years with no suspect, no arrest, and no trace of either of them. Florence Okpieluk is still missing from a beach outside Nome, her case open and unsolved, her daughter growing up without her. Wade Tackett was most likely taken by the cold water on a calm summer afternoon, but his body was never found, and after all these years, he is listed among the missing still. And Hale Boggs, Nick Begich, Russell Brown, and Don Johns are still out there in the mountains and the water, more than 50 years gone, and will most likely never be found. But behind every one of those case files was a real person, and I want to spend our last minutes together with them, and not with the people who harmed them. Sophie Sergey was a young woman from a village on the Yukon River who left college to save up for braces, who spent her last full day at the movies and out on a drive with friends, who was almost home free. Bonnie Craig was a teenager who got up in the dark and walked 2.5 miles because she refused to be late for a class she loved, whose mother would not accept a comforting lie and fought for the truth until she got it. Sonia Ivanov was 19, an athlete and a hospital worker from the Bering Sea coast who was saving her paychecks to go to school in Hawaii, who felt safe walking home in her own small town, and who should have been. The women Robert Hansen took were dancers and sex workers and travelers, women a whole city had trained itself not to see, and they were daughters and sisters and friends, every one of them, as real and as loved as anyone in this story. Sherry Morrow and Paula Goulding and Joanna Messina and the ones we can only call by the names strangers gave them. Eklutna Annie and Horseshoe Harriet, still waiting, after all these years, for someone to remember what their mothers called them. John Hartman was a 15-year-old boy who died alone on a cold street and whose murder was never truly solved because the system was so sure it already had its answer. Marvin Roberts, Eugene Vent, George Fries, and Kevin Pease were 4 young men who lost 18 years of their lives to that same certainty, and who never stopped saying the one true thing they had. Della Brown was a woman fighting her own battles who deserved, at the very least, for a neighbor to pick up a phone. Mindy Schloss was a nurse who spent her life caring for other people and was weeks away from finally working for herself. Cynthia Hoffman was a trusting young woman who believed she was going on a hike with the best friend she loved, and whose father has fought ever since to make sure the world remembers her as a person and not as the thing that was done to her. Jessica Bagan was a true Sitka kid who loved to fish and to cook, who wanted to leave home to study photography, and who walked a single mile on the night after her birthday and never arrived. Scott and Amy Fandel were a 13-year-old boy and his 8-year-old sister, who were doing nothing more dangerous than making a late snack in their own kitchen, and who have been missing now for so long that they should be grandparents. And Florence Okpieluk was a young mother who worked hard to learn the old Inupiaq ways so that she could hand them down to her daughter, and who is still, tonight, somewhere out past the edge of Nome, waiting to be brought home. Kent Lepink was a man who loved someone with his whole heart and was warned that it would cost him, and it did. Wade Tackett was a 17-year-old boy who went out onto calm water on a bright summer day and never came back, and whose mother spent the rest of her life unable to close the door the water left open. And Hale Boggs, and Nick Beggish, and Russell Brown, and Don Johns were 4 men who got on a plane on an ordinary Monday morning, a leader and a father of 6, and a young aide and a pilot, and who never came home, and who left behind families that have now been waiting longer than most of us have been alive. Have you noticed the thread that runs through so many of them? Again and again tonight, the people who were most in danger were the people the world had already decided to look at a little less carefully. The young native woman, the woman with an addiction, the dancer, the man living with mental illness, the 4 indigenous men who made convenient suspects. Alaska is vast and cold and genuinely dangerous, and the land takes people. That much is true. But the land is not the only thing that lets a person disappear. Indifference does it too. Every time we decide, quietly, that some lives are worth watching more closely than others, we build the exact blind spot that the worst among us learn to hunt in. The cold hides the evidence, but it is the looking away that lets the crime happen in the first place. That is the real reason to sit with stories like these, slowly and carefully and all the way to the end. Not for the fear of it, not to be frightened before sleep, but because attention is the one thing we can actually give these people now. To say their names, to remember that Sophie wanted braces and Sonia wanted Hawaii and Mindy wanted her own practice, and that Nick Begich had 6 kids waiting for him in a house he never got back to. To refuse, in our own small way, to look away. So tonight, as you think about their stories, all of them, the answered and the unanswered, maybe remember these people not for how they died, but for how they lived, and for how ordinary their last days were, right up until they weren't. Remember that most of them were just going about a normal Tuesday, walking to a bus, stepping out for a cigarette, heading home in the rain, boarding a flight. The most ordinary things in the world, in the most beautiful and unforgiving place in the country, on days that should have ended like any other. Some of their stories found answers, and some never will. The 4 men in that plane are still up there in the sky country, and someone, someday, with the ice giving up its old secrets, may yet bring them home. Until then, their families keep waiting, the way so many Alaska families are still waiting tonight. Their stories are unfinished, and the least we can do is not forget how they began.